Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your exam. A full textbook, tons of questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast, get 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today we have Sam Hassell from Westchester Prep and also Great Minds College Advising with us today, and really excited to have you back on the show, Sam. I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm happy to be back on the show. My name is Sam Hassell, as Tyler mentioned, and I'm one of the owners at Westchester Prep. So we are a full-service boutique tutoring, test prep, and college advising company located in Westchester, New York, right above New York City. And I
Mhm.
particularly help to direct and run our college advising branch, which is called Great Minds Advising.
Great. Yeah, and so today, that makes you a good person to talk about why did you see students not get into the highly selective schools, right? And so maybe first, what do you define as highly selective schools? And then I'd love for you to jump in with sort of some of these reasons where you saw some applicants fall short.
Sure. So, first off, I'll caution that these weren't our students. Our students did very well in the application cycle. But of course, you have the overall applicant pools, and not everybody, particularly when they're applying to the top colleges, gets the results that they want. So, in terms of
Mhm.
highly selective, there's a lot of different selection gradients we could talk about. Using the U.S. News rankings is a typical way of sorting colleges. We're particularly talking about top 25 national universities, I would say. These are the Ivy Leagues, but then also, very strong schools like Michigan, UVA, USC, the UCs, Berkeley, UCLA. These tend to be schools that have overall acceptance rates that are probably around 10%, might be 10
Mhm.
to 15%. And also, you could throw in a couple of your very highly selective liberal arts colleges like a Williams or an Amherst that, also have acceptance ranges around there.
Right. Great. Yeah, so then let's go through these reasons. So what's number one?
Sure. So, number one, the biggest mistake that we see that students applying to these schools make is they have great grades, they have good standardized test scores, but they often lack the sort of resume that elite colleges are looking for. And the sort of resume that would help to differentiate them among all the other students who took hard classes, have an A average, and really good test scores. So, what we mean
Mhm.
by having a resume, we want it to be a focused resume. We want it to be relevant. So, the student really needs to have some sort of interest or passion, ideally one that's going to be anchored in their future college study. So, if you are planning on going to Carnegie Mellon to study computer science. You better have done a lot of stuff in the field of computer science to be admitted on top of your metrics. And so,
Right.
students who are really looking to major in something particularly, or even if they don't 100% know, regardless, they still have to put together what we often call an admission story. It's something that is a through line that connects different activities that they've partaken in. If they want to study something in business, have they taken competitive programs in business, summer programs? Have they done additional coursework? Have they run a business? Are they the founder and leader of their business club at school? Do they do entrepreneurial initiatives? And really, you're
Mhm.
trying to hit, and we'll talk about the depth aspect in a second, but really trying to hit several
Mhm.
activities and maybe even awards, competitions, depending on fields that would really speak to this singular focus. That's
Right.
one way of doing it. So a student might say, I know I'm interested in business or computer science or et cetera, et cetera. The other way is a student just sort of looks at what they've done. We sort of audit what their interests are. And they might actually end up just backing into their major later on, right? So it's like, oh, we look at your
Mhm.
resume and what theme can we find from all these activities? That's the major that we're going to put down, because a lot of times the major can be changed later on. It's flexible. But the idea is you need evidence in your resume to support what you're going to do in college and to support a focused story when they're reading your application.
Mhm. And it's also I think that it's sort of the bad advice, I guess, or maybe not even it was bad advice then, but just the advice that we got when we were kids and maybe sort of is being translated to sort of some kids today that is no longer relevant is this idea of being well-rounded, right? I think that there's this idea, call it 10, 20 years ago, where like colleges wanted well-rounded people with like sort of a diverse set of experiences. And that's not really the priority anymore, as far as I can tell, right? Like, I think now colleges want people that, are arrows, not circles, right? That are much more specialized, both in their interest and in sort of what they talk about or focus on their applications.
100%. Yes. Now we use a lot of sharp object terms like being pointy or having a hook, instead of the
Mhm.
well-roundedness to sort of. And I think one really important part of that is just if a lot of parents, if they're thinking of like applying to a job or putting together a resume, you need to have relevant experience for the position, right? We can't just be
Mhm.
throwing out like I was a Target cashier when I was 14 and then I did this. It needs to be relevant and they're reading it in maybe 8 minutes. So like you need to get to the point fast.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And so then you mentioned depth. So let's talk a little bit about depth as well. Not just a focus, but kind of having some depth behind that focus. It sounds like, I mean, you already talked about, you've got to go outside of just your coursework. So can we talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the most typical problem that we see is a lot of students, parents, families, guidance counselors, school administrators. I mean, I look even through websites of, supposedly quote unquote some of the top private schools in the United States, and their websites still have information that is like clearly wrong strategically for getting kids into top colleges. It clearly talks about all of the very cliche pillars of a resume, like a sport, an instrument, community service. And those things just don't, at least on their service, separate students.
Hmm.
Now, that's kind of the first problem that we're typically solving, right? Because most people need to get out of the well-rounded notion and just these typical, I call it just like box checking, like, oh, I have volunteer hours, I played the cross, they're just checking boxes basically, right?
Right.
Once we get them away from that and into more of like, I need to do and partake in activities and maybe competitions, awards, etc., that have a certain focus. Well, now the question sort of becomes how deep do you need to drill into this focus, right? How deep do we need to penetrate
Hmm.
into that vertical, right? And there are a lot of students who actually are very focused. They're not falling into the well-rounded trap. They know, like, I want to do CS, I want to do business. But then they might be applying to Stanford, right? And you might
Hmm.
be extremely deep, right? And still get rejected, right?
Hmm.
Because you're now competing with kids who are maybe at a national level caliber in your field, right? If you're in math, there's just tons of kids who've been doing math competitions, they're math athletes, like, and maybe you've won regional math competitions. That's great, but it's
Hmm.
not quite national, and national's not
Right.
international, right? And
Yeah, and also, I mean, the other like we actually have an AMC course as well, and like that's like the pitch with that, right? Is that it's one of the few things left that's like super hard to do, and it's a national competition that's like nationally recognized. I think that it sounds like you need to level up to that kind of level, kind of whatever you're doing, right? Because I'm sure there's competitions for CS and robotics and whatever else. You need to level up to like a pretty high level of competition as a high school student for it to really matter, which is pretty crazy. But I mean, Stanford's very hard to get into.
definitely, right? And so I sort of one of the terms that I sort of use is like a scarcity threshold. You need to hit a certain threshold of scarcity or uniqueness, and you can sort of compute
Hmm.
this roughly by just how many seats are there available, how many people are applying, and you can do sort of some simple math, right? It's like if you're at, if you go up to calculus BC, it's like, well, I could actually
Hmm.
back into how many kids are past calculus BC, like in a certain region. In a high school, I'll know like there are two sections of classes where the kids are post calculus BC already. They take BC in 11th grade. So it's like you're already talking
Hmm.
50 kids in your high school already are taking past, like they're already past calculus BC. And then it's like, like you can start, and then we'll get a kid and they're like, well, I'm taking calculus AB. I want to apply to Stanford. It's like, for something in STEM or math, it's like how many kids across the country do you think are already well past where you are at math level, right?
Hmm.
And so The problem that's very unfortunate is not a lot of people actually understand well enough how many kids are out there that are actually at their level or beyond. And so it's really hard, and you really need to know from like a very national, very broad standpoint. You'd have seen all of these kids, and know like what is the standard, because I mean, we've even seen, we had an applicant who came to us after he had applied single choice early action to Stanford this year. And this kid had maybe like 6 national level, math, computing awards, just an extraordinary resume, but you're still applying to Stanford. And like that depth, even as extraordinary as that depth might be, it's still not enough. So students really do have to focus on, if they're really aiming for the very top, they need to do things that are going to be at like an extraordinary level of initiative and depth, high value competitions, awards, things that will really separate them. And awards aren't always, competitions awards aren't always easy to control. It'd be nice to just tell a kid, go be on the international math Olympiad team and like beat China. But that's not super easy. So we have to often give them projects and things that actually will make them very unique in other ways too, but they have to be very unique and stand out.
Right. Yeah, and I think that that desire for uniqueness can kind of lead to people maybe trying to do something kind of like out there and weird. But like what I would advise, I guess, from my conversations, I'm not a college admissions advisor like you are, but I have a lot of conversations with people like you. And it sounds like, even if you are trying to be unique, you still can't, do something totally out of left field. It's still got to be, relevant to that focus that the rest of your application has, which actually is helpful for trying to brainstorm like what you can do, right? Yeah. Well, then let's talk about, what else are sort of the mistakes to avoid here, right? It sounds like, we were talking a bit about just like, calculus A, B, B, C. It sounds like with, grade inflation, I think there's something, I forget where I saw this. It might have been in like a Facebook group or something of tutors that I'm in, but it's like something along the lines of like for the top most selective schools, like 88% of them have a 4.0 or better GPA or something like that, which is pretty crazy. So it seems like, having good academics has got to be table stakes, really.
Yes. So we often do call it table stakes. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for admission. And often at your top schools, but even sometimes nowadays, like you'll pull up a school like maybe a Villanova that's like, it actually used to be ranked as a regional school, but now it's kind of it kind of moved its way into the U.S. national rankings. And that's maybe like a top 50 sort of a university, generally speaking. There's a lot of shuffling in the U.S. news rankings this year as they factored in different things. But the Villanova, statistics were somewhere along the lines of like around 90% of students were in the top 10% of their class, right? And that's not even like,
Oh,
you are many tiers down from like a very top school like a Harvard or Stanford, right? You're like talking about 5 tiers down, I would say. And even
right.
then,
No offense to the Villanova listeners, but yeah,
100%, no offense.
it's pretty competitive.
So it really is table stakes in terms of academics. Some things that we see that students do that are suboptimal academically. One thing is, you just have students and they have multiple B's on their transcript, and they just don't realize how harmful those few B's can be to their candidacy when you're competing against crops of
Mhm,
students that are mostly just straight A students across the board, right? I think one thing
mhm.
that really gets overestimated is the GPA. The GPA is something that every single college admissions officer will tell you is almost meaningless, right? There's a million different
Mhm.
GPAs. Only in a couple of states in the United States do they have actually a standardized GPA system across the state. It's extremely unstandardized. It doesn't tell you about trends over time. It doesn't tell you about the classes that are more relevant to the kid's narrative, like if they want to do engineering, how they do in AP Physics C. It might be weighted, it might be not. It's just a mess, the GPA. Really, if you're applying to the top 25 national schools, you need to mostly, if not entirely, have a clean slate of A's on your transcript. Like if I'm an
Mhm.
admissions officer and I'm opening this, I don't want to see like, oh, there's a B here, there's a B there, or there's a B plus. unless you've really done something exceptional or really massively differentiated yourself in some other way. And there's a lot of nuance there, but one of the things that we often see is students just and families just still discount how harmful even having two B's on your transcript can be, if you're applying to these
Mhm.
schools. And
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's unfortunate, right? But like it's a symptom of the grade inflation problem where, if A's are easier to get, then it almost becomes like an A is like a check mark, like did the job, and then like anything other than an A is basically not.
yes, it can. I think part of it is grade inflation. Part of it is just students have way more resources. There's more international competition. There are way more students applying to these schools. And so this is just what happens when you have a huge supply demand imbalance, basically.
Mm,
When there are way more people who want, to go to a certain school than there are seats available, just every little imperfection gets magnified. And I don't think
mm,
people quite understand this looking from an individual standpoint. Because, a kid's sort of like, oh, I got one little beat. What does it matter? But it's like if you're an admissions officer and you're just reading through kid after kid after kid after kid who has straight A's, it's like that one kid who has that. It's, like they're just kind of the odd person out. And the way that I
mm.
often tend to analogize it is admissions is a relative game. So it's like if you were the second best gymnast in the world, but you want to win a gold medal, you could have a 9.99, but like it doesn't matter because there's still somebody better than you, right? And
Mhm.
that's just what kids are up against when they apply. And there are just so many great and talented kids. You might be like the most talented kid at your high school, but now you need to be one of the most talented kids in the country. And now you're talking about 30,000 high schools, not just your one high school, right?
Right. And where do you fall out of those 30,000
Right.
high school
And they don't know.
valedictorians
They
or
don't
whatever,
know because
right?
they don't have access. They don't have that broader bird's eye view. And it's basically like being an athlete where you're like the best swimmer on your club team locally. But then if you were to show up to like all of the best swimmers in the country in a national meet, like you would very quickly learn that there's a lot of extremely talented kids, right? So I think this is a
Right.
little bit of the like big fish in small ponds, sort of syndrome is like a lot of kids only can compare themselves at a regional level unless they're maybe doing things that are very like nationally focused and they're constantly exposing themselves to like the best kids in their areas that they might have a better sense of what those kids are up to. So little things like B's can definitely hurt. The top schools are expecting, it's just an expectation. I tell people like not to worry about their weighted GPA. If you're applying to a top 25 school, they're in all likelihood unweighting your GPA anyway, because it's very variable by the high school. They're just expecting you basically have maxed out your course rigor, or you've come very close to maxing out the available course rigor. And if you're talking about the very, very top schools like a Caltech, a Stanford, MIT, Harvard, a lot of those kids go well beyond their high school curriculum. They take college courses, they take additional enrichment. We had a student who skipped several grades of math because she took pre-calculus over the summer to get into calculus, in 10th grade. So, the bar is super high in terms of course rigor. It's just expected you're taking most of the top classes. You might be able to duck out of one or two strategically, but not a ton. And then the last thing I'll sort of
Right.
say,
I think,
yep,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
the last thing I'll say is pay attention to the bookends of your transcript. There are two times that I think are particularly sensitive. We tend to see a lot of kids in freshman year get some of those B's because they're just getting acquainted to high school. And, they're not super mature. They're like just getting into their rhythm. And it's like they take that really hard math class, like the highest track, and then get a B and like just stay in the class the whole year. And it just ends up being a B. And they want to apply for STEM 3 years later. Um, so I think pay attention, like have a really strong mindset going into and starting high school. There's
Hmm.
sort of UCs in certain schools that will say we don't focus on ninth grade as much, but they still look at the grades. That's a point where we tend to see like kids don't do particularly well as in ninth grade. Certainly 11th grade when the course rigor ratchets up a lot, and then senior year right before you apply to college, you want those senior year grades, those first quarter grades, etc., to be really strong because you also won't have the whole year to make up the grade, right? It's only you kind of get one quarter or two, and then that's what colleges see if you're sending your grades, which you'd
Hmm.
like to.
Yeah. And I think particularly with your kind of first 2 points around, the GPA and around course rigor. At the end of the day, if Stanford is choosing between sort of the best kids at high schools nationwide, what they want to see is that you basically challenge yourself as much as your local school would allow, whether that's with courses and then also getting A's in those courses, because they want to see you essentially like max out at that difficulty level, because then maybe you have the ability to go above that and like have like a higher ceiling. Versus if you're, running into problems at, that kind of difficulty level, well, that's a lot less interesting than the people that are maxed out and could potentially go above and beyond.
Sure. And one quick misconception that I'll sort of throw out, because admissions officers say this a lot, is a student will only be judged in terms of the course rigor that's afforded by their high school. So some high schools have very advanced math, science curricula. Other schools don't, right? So some schools, actually, a lot of schools in the United States don't even have calculus, which is kind of mind blowing to certain students.
Hmm.
However, I think students need to be very careful. If your school is particularly limiting in terms of what you can take, even though an admissions officer is going to say that they're going to review your application in the context of your school, there's still like a little bit of an asterisk there. If there's another kid and they've gone well beyond what their high school offers, right, and you haven't, you can just imagine which
Sure.
one of the two they're going to take. So like, even though it's always better to have done the extra work than to have an excuse, right? You could say, oh, my high school didn't give me these extra courses that I could take, but there's always some other kid out there who found a way around the problem and just enrolled in a college,
Hmm.
college course. And so I think admissions officers sort of talk out of both sides of their mouth. It sounds good, like we're only going to judge you compared to your high school, but it's very hard when there are schools that are so beyond in terms of their curriculum to not give those kids an advantage if their high school curriculum is so much more advanced than another kid's high school curriculum.
Right. And I mean, it sounds like the kind of key takeaway from that is like you've got to be proactive if you don't have the level of rigor that you feel like you could achieve in your local high school classes, then you need to go figure out where you can find that.
100%.
Yeah. Then let's talk about yeah, what is kind of the next big thing, right? We haven't really talked about like ACT, SAT at all. Like how does that factor into this?
Sure. So, as we know, a lot of schools have been test optional. So,
Yeah.
there are a couple of reasons, a student might not have been admitted to, highly selective school. One is they maybe didn't submit test scores, which possibly might have been the right choice if they did not have a test score, that was sufficiently competitive for the college. In some cases, that could have been a good call. But
Hmm.
certainly, if you don't have that in your application, no matter what colleges have said, they've tried to like talk their way around this and sort of square a circle. All else being equal, between two students, one who has a 1500 SAT and one who doesn't, they're more likely to take the kid who has the 1500 SAT and has the objective standardized evidence. And a large part of that is a check against the grade inflation in the United States, and also just a standardized way of evaluating applicants, right? It's very difficult to compare apples and oranges from a kid who goes to school in Kentucky versus a kid who goes to this private school in New York City. And so standardized testing, provides a lot of that, hedging against the heterogeneity of the applicant pool and backgrounds. So certainly a student
Right.
might have failed to get in for, possibly being test optional and, competing against other students who submitted. The other one would be, they submitted a score and it maybe was very low in the range, the college's range, or it fell even below or even just outside of the range altogether. So if you're applying to a school whose,
Hmm.
SAT range is like a 1480 to like a 1540 and you submitted a 1430, that's not the best. Colleges really care about their score ranges, their impression, their prestige factor. And it often, has been advised during test optional to really submit scores mostly when you're at least in the range, but more ideally like in the middle or higher part of the range.
Yeah, definitely like try to aim for above the average if you can. And then, I mean, the other part of it too is I think that, and we'll talk about this more in depth in another episode, but definitely like feel like the tide is turning away from test optional students as top universities are finding that the test optional students are not performing well in the class with them, right? The ones who didn't submit test scores. So it may, it may mean a knock against you, even though they, like you said, the admissions officers will tell you, we're not going to knock you if you don't submit test scores. I kind of doubt that.
Yes, it's sort of this they it is true that from an absolute vantage point, they're not saying this kid didn't submit test scores, so therefore we're penalizing them in a vacuum, right? But
Mhm.
admissions is not an absolute game, it's a relative game. You are competing against other students. So if you're competing against somebody who did something you didn't do that's impressive, you lose, right?
Yeah,
That's just how it
exactly.
works. And so that's why admissions officers always try to like, it's so hard they dance around the topic and it gets very confusing to people because it's not inherently a knock against you if you didn't submit a test score, but it can be a knock against you by virtue of you're competing against other kids who did submit a good test score and therefore will get the spot that you're looking for.
Right. And yeah, it's important to, account for this in your plans, right? Like you should be kind of getting a sense, both like taking like a full old practice SAT or old practice ACT to get some sense of what your score will be. I wouldn't necessarily believe or rely on diagnostic tests from third-party vendors, even though, people like us try really hard to make our tests good. At the end of the day, you should be taking like a real from the maker of the test, old test to get your kind of benchmark score even before you do prep. And then at the very least, you can get a sense for like what score ranges are achievable for you and how, then that should influence like your college list, right? Because if you're getting sort of 1,300, 1,400 SATs, it it's just going to be really, really hard to get into Stanford unless you get that up to the 1,500s, right? And that's pretty hard to do. So maybe that means you don't put Stanford on your list, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I guess that kind of leads me to maybe another like question that I had or about, mistakes to avoid when you're applying to colleges and sort of some of the lessons learned from this year is school selection. I feel like it's become, especially with the Common App, really popular to just blast your app to Stanford, Harvard, Yale anyway, even if it's like not really productive or realistic. And so, yeah, I just would love if you could like maybe dig into the school selection part of it too.
sure. Yeah, and I think circling back to just why college admissions has become so much more competitive, it is that technology piece and just how much easier it is to actually submit applications to all of these schools, right? If you were back,
Hmm.
in the olden days where you were, maybe sending in your application via carrier pigeon. I'm just kidding, but you were mailing it in, putting stamps, had to go to the post office, maybe this school had a little bit of a more different application. There wasn't as much of this sort of commonality between the schools in terms of their application materials. Then it puts up a lot more barriers to entry, for students putting in so many applications.
Hmm.
The easier we've made it for students to apply to more and more schools, the more inefficiency there also is in the system because you just have kids sort of what I call like spraying and praying. And that sort of
Yeah.
has created some additional complexities. Now, in terms of school selection, so I think there's a lot of I think this is one of the most important topics. A lot of students are in that mindset
Hmm.
of what I call like the spray and pray. They also have this bit of like a mathematical fallacy that because I apply to so many schools, I must get into X number of them, right? And that doesn't
Right.
make any sense, right? These are independent events from, a probability standpoint, right? It's not like just because you could apply to 18, 24, 30, it doesn't necessarily increase the probability that you're going to get into any single one of those, right? And it just tends to be like a way of thinking that is very entrenched in students and families. Like, if I just ratchet up the denominator, right, surely there's going to be a few schools in the numerator, right? Like, I can't miss on all of them, right? And it's just it's a wrong way of thinking. But it tends to sort of be a very common way of thinking. The second thing that I think is really, really important, and this hasn't always been the case, but the way that you apply to college, I could actually make a case, is more important than actually the schools that you apply to, right? So even if we compare, even if we compare, the acceptance rate for a school under, one plan. So say you're doing early decision where you're putting a binding commitment to the school. You're typically applying by November 1st. You are saying, this is my top choice school. If you accept me, I will come, which is very valuable to a college, right? Because they're getting a lot of kids.
Yeah.
What we just talked about, they're getting a lot of applications. They don't know who's actually coming to Dartmouth versus Dartmouth is like their safety and they want to go to Princeton, right? So,
right. And also they have a metric internally. I think it's called like yield or something like along those lines, where it's what percentage of people that were accepted actually went.
Correct. And even for a lot of the top schools, it's still not that great. Like, it's only like 50 or 60% of the people that they accept actually come to the school. That's like a top 25 school has maybe a 50 to 65% yield rate. The best in the country is like the Stanfords and Harvards that have like an 80+% yield rate. So a student who's applying early decision and putting in a binding commitment, if you're looking at that acceptance rate and you're talking about, an Ivy school, I'll just kind of take Dartmouth. That acceptance rate is in the high teens, right? And now if you're applying in the regular decision rounds, that acceptance rate is probably like around 5% or something, right? It's very low in the single digits. And so you're talking about maybe a 3x difference, in terms of your odds of applying early versus applying regular, right? That might be the same difference as applying to two different schools, one of which you think is 3 times easier to get into, right? Versus the other one. And so actually, we use this term in research, which is like the within group variance versus the between group variance. The within just one school variance between the acceptance rates could be the same or more than the variance between the acceptance rates between 2 or 3 different institutions altogether, right? And so the way that you apply to the college is extremely important. And a lot of people still, I think it's caught on how much of an odds boost it is to apply early to a college because of how competitive it is. But it still hasn't caught on enough. You still see a lot of people who don't take advantage of early decision odds. They just say, oh, I'll just wait until the spring, see all of my acceptances, and then I'll choose which one. And then they end up in all the regular decision pools. And they're competing against so many applicants where you might have the ED pool might be like 3,500 kids. And now the regular decision pool is 50,000 kids, right? And so I think this is one of the most important parts. If you were to say, what's the easiest thing that I could do that might actually improve my odds as much as just about anything in my whole profile, it would probably be doing an early decision, right? And so if you're then trying to reverse engineer from giving yourself the best shot, you would say, well, what do I need to do to put in an early decision? I need to do all my research on the schools. I need to do all my due diligence. I need to see the schools. I need to know which one I have really good chance at with the early decision, so I don't waste that, sort of bullet in my chamber, because it's a really valuable bullet in my chamber, and you only have a couple of them. You can only do one ED, and then if there's an ED2 school on your list, you could maybe do an early decision too. But that's it. And then after that, you're just in the regular decision pools with a lot of other students, or the EA pools. So one of the big things that I would encourage a lot of students, we just see this again and again and again. People have this I'm going to apply to 20 schools. I'm not going to do early decisions. So you're going to be in the regular decision pools at all of those schools. You want to apply to UCLA? There's no ED. You're being compared against 150,000 people, right? So find out, what are my top choices? And, am I just going to waste the ED because I'm using it as like a super, super reach? That's the other thing. Like, people use EDs on schools that they don't have a chance of getting into even with the early decision, right? And then they wasted the early decision, right? So I wish people would just be quite a bit more savvy when it came to saying, I'm going to really try to figure out what are my top picks and make this a more calibrated process. These are really my top 2 or 3. Do they have ED? Do they have ED2? Not thinking I'm just going to, throw this super wide net and just hope something comes back because I've applied to so many schools.
Right. Well, and also it's very it's like, I don't know, I played video games. It's like it's like a power up. You only get two,
Yes.
right? But like you should use those. Even if you're using it to apply to the most difficult or hardest to get into school or whatever, it's still better than not using it at all.
Yes, I would say that's better than not using it. What's even better than
Mhm.
that is use it for a school where you probably wouldn't get in regular decision, but if you do early decision, you can get in, and that's very common. If you end up on a wait
Mhm.
list, so all of these kids, all these decisions are going to come back. We're in March, right? If you find yourself on a
Mhm.
wait list in the month of March, what that often means is if you had done early decision, you would have been admitted to the school, right? Because a
Right.
waitlist means you were marginal, right? It doesn't mean you were like an
Mhm.
absolute, definitely not in play. That's one of the ways of the school sort of telling you like you were on the cusp. And, maybe if you had put in a binding
Mhm.
commitment and been willing to make this your top choice, you would have gotten in all likelihood.
Right. Because yeah, schools care a lot about you being committed and that demonstrated interest, right? Like that you really want to go there. They don't want you to be somebody's silver medal if they can help it.
Definitely. All of these schools want to be loved, right? They want to know that you're actually coming to the school. They don't want to just accept a bunch of kids who are actually not going to enroll in the school. And that's what a lot of students
Mhm.
don't understand. Is it's really meaningful to the school that that's your top choice, and you show that in a lot of ways. The easiest way and the most succinct way is just putting in a binding commitment and saying, "I will go if I'm taken."
Yeah. Great. Well then, yeah, what are the other parts of the application that you're getting kind of feedback on, right? Like I think we haven't talked really about letters of recommendation yet. I'm curious if you kind of have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. So one of the most, I would say this might be one of the most overlooked parts of the application, particularly again when you're talking about very selective schools, because what you're talking about again is there's a very high threshold for those students separating themselves beyond just their metrics, their GPA, that they took a bunch of APs, their test scores. That's, as we've sort of said, like table stakes, right? Um,
Hmm.
and also with a lot of those students, those teachers are going to have pretty good things to say, generally speaking, right? These are very strong students, right? So
Hmm.
there's going to be a pretty strong positivity bias, for those students and teachers writing those recommendation. And a lot of students just don't put a ton of thought into really arming those teachers with amazing anecdotes from the class, really like big intellectual triumphs, projects. They just kind of assume that, maybe the teacher will remember, and it's like the teacher has a whole bunch of students, unless you're really such an amazing standout and have built such an exceptional relationship with this teacher where it's like you are so top of their mind, you can't just count on them remembering every little thing that you did that was amazing from the class, right?
Right.
But you want them to remember every little thing that you did that was amazing from the class when they write your letter of recommendation to a top school, right? So
Hmm.
I think a lot of people discount that humans' memory is very fallible, and you need to supply them with a lot of information. This is the one of the things that we really help our students with when we're advising them. A lot of those students' teachers give recommendation questionnaires where they ask them questions about these, sort of moments in class. If they don't, we make sure the student writes a cover letter and includes all of their like great moments, right? Their little intellectual curiosities, the time they went above and beyond in a project, times they were nice and nurtured like a great classroom environment. They were generous with other students. They helped other students. They were kind. These things, like a lot of people, they're just like, oh, I have an A in this class. It's like, that's not what colleges are just looking for. It's just an A, right? That's just
Hmm.
part of the normal process of that's what a lot of students have. But it's the little student who like, it's the student who helped a student and, maybe tutored them. A student who like, we had a girl who like, whenever they were on the Zooms during COVID would always like send little like smiley emojis and like say hi to everybody at the top of the Zoom. And they look for a lot of that. And I would say they're looking for kids who have intellectual superlatives, really stand out, go above and beyond, built really strong relationships with their teacher. They go to the office hours. They're thinking about ways of connecting the topics in ways that other students aren't thinking about. And they're really strong intangibles, like they're great leaders. They make others better around them. They're kind, generous, collaborative, not competitive. And all of those anecdotes or any evidence, like we both, make sure we're coaching students, like be a good kid in class, try to stand out, etc., so they can build really strong letters of recommendation. And then when it comes time to writing them or their teacher sends them the questionnaire, we're helping them reference those anecdotes, right, from the class to make it as easy for the teacher as possible, right? It's like they could almost just copy and paste this into their letter of recommendation, and we would know that it's really compelling content, right? And
Right.
if you leave a teacher to his or her own devices, they might have 50 letters of recommendation to write. They might be writing them 2 weeks before all the deadlines. They have all their courses they're teaching. You want to make it as easy as possible, and you want to give them all the best content right there in front of them. So if like they just had to write the letter in like a half an hour, 20 minutes, they could just literally just look at all the stuff that you've served up for them and write you a really amazing letter of recommendation. And I'll say the same thing is true with the guidance counselor. A lot of students do not have a good relationship with their guidance counselor or any relationship, but that person also writes you a letter of recommendation. And you also need to do the same thing, which is build a relationship with them and furnish them really great anecdotes. But it's a little bit different from a teacher recommendation. For a guidance counselor, they're contextualizing how much of the student challenged themselves in the context of the school's curriculum. What do they do in the community? What do they do in this school club? What do the teachers say about them? It's a little bit of a different letter because it's not just about what they did in one class. It's more of how they sort of exist or function or where they stand in the whole school community. So it's a much broader letter, but even in a lot of ways, that's even possibly even more important than the teacher recommendations.
Right. Yeah. And I think also it's, like you said, it's maybe not a priority for some students. And I think letters of recommendation in general for a lot of students can be kind of a situation where they're like, oh, yeah, I have to do this. Who are the people that I know the best? Okay, I guess I'll talk to them, right? Like instead of being thought like strategic about it ahead of time. And yeah, like I don't know, you should like the person that you want to ask for the letter from anyway, and it shouldn't necessarily be like you being someone's friend that you otherwise wouldn't want to talk to just because of the letter. Like it should be someone that you genuinely like because I think that will probably be mutual. But at the end of the day, yeah, like plan ahead for this stuff,
Definitely.
right? At least starting in junior year, I think.
Definitely at the beginning of junior year, because those are the teachers that you're going to be typically asking to write your letters of recommendation. And if you haven't done anything special that stands out in the class, then you won't have a lot to reference back to for those letters of recommendation. Like you won't have a lot of compelling anecdotes to furnish to your
Mhm.
teacher. But I think you're also right. We talked about proactivity when it comes to things like, you have to sort of be the captain of your own ship and your own destiny. And like, if your school really didn't offer certain courses that were helpful for your candidacy or your narrative or your focus in a field, being proactive and saying, this is an obstacle that I have to overcome, same thing. Proactivity just wins. Like all the kids who really go to these top schools, they're extremely proactive and they're thinking about these things well in advance. And they're not just relying in a passive manner, just saying like, oh yeah, I asked my chemistry teacher, like I listed them. They're gonna just without me doing anything, they're gonna write me a glowing letter of recommendation. That's just don't assume that that's just the case, right? Assume the worst.
Right.
Assume they're gonna start writing this. I always say, assume they're gonna start writing your letter of recommendation like 10 minutes before it's due, and they're like in a mad
Mhm.
panic. And then you would say, oh yeah, this sheet that I'm gonna give them, this cheat sheet for the letter, would be super helpful for them to have in that case that they can refer to.
Yeah, well, and that cheat sheet also is really important because it guides them to talking about things that are congruent with what you're talking about in your application, right? And kind of like the themes of your application, whether that's leadership or, deep interest in computer science or whatever it may be. And maybe that's a good one to talk about here is kind of what mistakes do you see students making with regards to kind of like their application themes, or are they not even making really themes at all? When I say theme, I'm talking about sort of like a cohesive story across the whole application.
Sure. So, to sort of take your point, I think the first thing is just knowing that you need to have a theme, right? It's not
Yeah.
even necessarily like we're not even to step two, which is like, what is the theme or what's the quality or the nature of the theme? It's just that most students don't even have a theme in the first place in their applications, right? They have no slogan. It's not like they're the cognitive science kid, but this is the social entrepreneur. Like, it's just all over the place, right? And this goes part and parcel with the well-roundedness, right? It's like if you're a
Mhm.
dabbler and it's more about quantity versus quality and breadth and checking boxes, then you're going to be all over the place in terms of your activities, right? And there's not
Mhm.
going to be any real through line or theme. And this is two things. When we just talked about the recommendation process, there's sort of the building, like you have to build good experiences and anecdotes and be that kid in the classroom. Then there's the storytelling part of it, which is like now referencing those anecdotes that you actually had from the class. Same way when it comes to
Mhm.
the resume building and your candidacy building phase is having cohesive activities and theme, a theme that speaks to, I think I want to do this. Or even if you don't 100% know what you want to do, at least pursuing a cluster of activities that at least are organized around what your interests or passions seem to be at this point in time. That's the building phase. Like you're starting to put the pieces that you now can reference. But now when you get to the
Mhm.
applications, you're in the storytelling phase, right? Now it's like you need to, even if there's like a little bit of messiness, like, I kind of did this activity, doesn't fit into the theme. You might want to cut that activity out a little bit or just like diminish its significance. You now get to choose what you want to talk about, right? So it's like you're writing the essays. You can choose what
Mhm.
you want to talk about. So you get to emphasize more of the theme that you want to hit or not. And so this is really the later stage part of, really presenting yourself in a focused way. Like the application needs to have a theme. If you're going to be the student who is going to do aerospace engineering, well, that
Mhm.
student's personal essay is going to talk about themes that are relevant to aerospace engineering. When they get to their school specific supplements, their school specific supplements are going
Mhm.
to talk about how they're going to pursue aerospace engineering with this class, that professor's research lab, this club, right? And so what you really see is there's a clear through line in the whole application of what this kid stands for, what they represent. They've done these activities, they all make sense. It's like a relevant resume. The kid's applying for aerospace
Mhm.
engineering. They worked at NASA. They're the head of, yeah, you could see these competitions are related to this, and you just want to be able to see that through line and that relevance that runs through everything. So the first thing is kids need to have a theme. If you're writing your personal essay about grandma and then your activities list is like lacrosse, an instrument, um, you know,
Mhm.
just like all over the place, like a lot of students, and then your additional information section is blank, or who knows what a lot of students put in the additional information section. Our students put in the additional information section more information about their hook and their theme. So it's like if they're doing science research on a topic, they'll talk about their science research on that topic a lot more in the additional information section, right? But it's
Mhm.
all has a through line. And at 8 minutes, I don't, as an admissions officer, we often say like we don't want to be they don't want to be Sherlock Holmes. They don't want to be a detective trying to figure out what does X have to do with Y, with Z, with A, with B, with C. This is about grandma, then it's about this other random thing. Now he's talking about Harry Potter. Now he's putting it's just like all over the place, right? And I think this also comes again, it comes back to proactivity. The student needs to go into this with the mindset of imposing structure, not the
Mhm.
mindset they often go on, which is not a proactive, it's a reactive mindset. It's like, oh, they asked me a question, I'll just respond to the question. It's like, no, 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 no. You need to think about what the
Right.
content is that you're responding with, how it aligns with the rest of the content, does it repeat similar themes, etc.
Yeah, do you have basically like a consistent theme across the whole application that you're kind of trying to make sure you tie things back to? And really, you should have multiple. You should have sort of like what you want to do, but then also like who are you, right? What do you want to be known for? Yeah, I think that's all great. And I think there's just a lot of application intangibles in general that, like, I think that students kind of miss out on when they're doing these applications, right? And it's not always their fault, right? we are in this business and see tons of these applications. Most of these students are only kind of doing this once,
Yes.
and haven't had experience around it, right? But what are some of the other things in applications that you want to call out here that you want people to, mistakes that people should avoid, or just like things that are reasons why people didn't get into these top schools?
Yes. So there are several, and I think speaking to your point about students have a very limited advantage with this process, right? It's like they're a sample size of one, and they have very limited perspective. So this is why the process is so difficult, because they're not, the way they're actually being evaluated is like between other students in a pile, right? But like what they see is just their own application, right? They only see everything from the first person perspective, and they don't know what's sort of coming across the desk. And I'll sort of say on that theme, what that actually makes it very difficult for a student or family, etc., to determine is how unique is this content in the student's application. Because a lot of students
Mhm.
like just answer the question, or they might think what they have to say is very unique. But if they were behind the desk reading these applications, little do they know, like the same kids are saying all the same stuff, right? Again and again and again.
Mhm.
And this isn't differentiating you, right?
Mhm.
That's where it's really important, not to toot our own horn, but it's like we have experience when we walk it through the process. We know all of the cliche stuff that all of the kids talk about, right? And it like might seem very
Mhm.
compelling to you in a vacuum, but it's like they're just getting the same stuff over and over and over and over again, right? A lot of that is
Right.
just like typical emphasis on, what we might call something like conspicuous compassion. So conspicuous compassion is like, kids know that colleges sort of want kids who like do community service or take a service perspective, but then they kind of like they talk about things that are very generic. Like I worked in a soup kitchen, and it's like so many kids are talking about that same experience. Talk about a much more unique form of service, right? Ideally calibrated to your academic narrative, right? So
Mhm.
if you're a student who's interested in computer science, did you go to like the local library and help some kids learn coding, right? Because like that would be both
Mhm.
academically relevant and it would be a form of service, basically, right? And so
Mhm.
students who fall into this what we call conspicuous compassion is they're like sort of virtue signaling. Like I think this is what the colleges are looking for. Like I'm such a great person. Like I help all these kids. Leave that for like your teacher.
Yeah, I volunteered at a food bank once for an hour.
Yes. Yes. You know who's best to say some of those things? Your guidance counselor, your teachers. It's better coming out of their mouth in some cases because it doesn't come across in the same sort of like harsh way of like virtue signaling, right? It's very hard to talk about what a good person you are if you're the person who's doing it, right?
Yeah.
Certain content, that's why it needs to be spread in other components, or it's best coming out of other people's mouths, not your mouth. Um,
Mhm.
One of the very inextricable problems of the admissions process is what these colleges are looking for are students who are going to make an impact on the world in some very hyper singular way, in some niche or some specific field, which speaks to the focus. You need to present yourself as being extremely promising in your field, but also if you start bragging too much about I won this honor, I won this award, you risk being extremely unlikable, right? And
Yeah.
there are a lot of very talented kids who are
Also
very
in life.
unlikable. Yes. Definitely, right? And unlikable is like a big boo, like it's a big rooting interest against your application instead of for your application, right? But this is very difficult because how do you walk this tightrope between presenting yourself as highly accomplished and somebody who's going to like possibly change the world, right? That's what the top schools are looking for,
Mhm.
somebody who's going to be like a game changer while not bragging too much or lacking in
Mhm.
humility. So that requires a very deft touch. And so I would encourage students to be very careful about how they present and talk about some of their honors, their awards, their, have somebody else look at it if it's not a professional and just check this for like humility, make sure it's very likable. In
Mhm.
that vein too, you also have students who maybe come from very privileged backgrounds and they inadvertently just tend to signal that in the application. Like the one we use a lot is
Mhm.
like, I've traveled to X number of countries, or maybe they did a very expensive summer program. That's not like a super prestigious summer program, but it's like, it's just a signal to the admissions officers that the student's family can maybe afford like a very expensive summer program, right? And so it's really more just signaling privilege instead of signaling like high level academic caliber. If the program's not a very
Mhm.
very like high quality program, what sometimes we call more like pay for play. And so there's all these little things that students sort of implant or put in their application that make them a little bit less likable. They say very common things like so many kids want to be a doctor, right? And so they focus about like I want to be a doctor. Most of those kids are going to go to college, and I think one of the most regretted majors in college is biology, pre med, right?
Mhm.
Um, there's no upside to you telling the school that you want to be a doctor because you're not applying to medical school, right? You're just going to liberal arts
Right.
college regardless. So there's all these little landmines that students need to navigate to actually stand out. If you understand what all of the other kids are saying, that would end up being very cliche or unlikable, etc.
Yeah, I mean, how do you kind of reconcile that when somebody does want to be a doctor, though? It's just an interesting question.
Yes, it's a good question, right? So first of all, like I said, they're not applying to medical school, right? So that's a very important distinction, right? There's no medical schools in the United States at an undergraduate level. You're not making that decision unless you're applying to a
Mhm.
combined program, right? If you're applying to a BS-MD program, you will have to tell them why you want to be a doctor. And of course, you have to tell them that you're going to become a doctor because you are going in under a program that actually is a combined program with an MD, right? Those programs are more rare. Most students in the United States are just going in at an undergraduate level, and they can study almost anything if they want to be a doctor. They could be a philosophy major, right? As long as they take the prerequisites for
Mhm.
medical school. If a student does want to be a doctor, they can potentially talk about it. They need to have an extremely impressive resume in the medical field. So a lot of students think,
Mhm.
I'm going to say I want to be a doctor, and I did some shadowing at a hospital, and I'm good at biology. Not enough. Definitely not for the top schools. Not even within a mile of being enough, right? Students who are going to be
Mhm.
competitive and might be applying for biology do novel science research in that field. They might be part of we have a lot of students who are on a leadership committee at their local high school doing very meaningful, high initiative, high impact projects in the medical field. They probably have three, four, five, six, seven activities that are in the medical field that are high initiative, high impact, might have a publication. They're working on science research. We had a student several years ago who wrote a newsletter for a kids' hospital explaining to the children at the hospital what their diseases meant in kids' terms, right?
Mhm.
Excellent, like amazing initiative and like really cool and likable, right? So
And also like special,
yes, and
right? Tying back to what you were talking about earlier.
definitely.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to choose a path, like most kids are just focused on a few career paths, right? Doctor, lawyer, CS, engineer, like typical most of the pre-professional. You have to understand the way that most people think is the way that most other people think too. Like most people think the same way that most other people think. So it's like when everybody's applying to these schools, they're all thinking in a very similar way, which is like, what are the careers that are the most prestigious, the most lucrative? And you're probably thinking that way. And so is probably just about everybody else. So if you're not
Right.
going against the grain, like if you're just going to choose something that probably a lot of kids want to do, like be a doctor or an engineer, it creates a much higher threshold for you now to be much more unique because you're choosing an overall umbrella that's very common, right? If you want to be like a literature major or linguistics major, you've already set like an overall frame that's already quite unique just on its surface. And so these
Mhm.
are things students need to take into account. They also, many of them don't know they actually want to be a doctor at this age. So to volunteer it and possibly throw themselves in with everybody else in a very cliche
Mhm.
way when they might take a couple of college and courses in college and then drop off the track anyway, as most students do, is like it could be harmful for no particular reason. They're not quite sure they want to be a doctor at this point in most cases, anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are all great tips. I think to wrap up here, I wanted to cover one thing that we haven't really talked about yet, which is, the school specific essays and other supplements that you have to submit. I feel like those, especially in the age of kids applying to 20 colleges, I feel like those are maybe getting rushed through, or maybe not, there's not as much care and attention given to them as might have been when you were applying to five colleges, right? So Can we talk about, like, can you tell me sort of what you've learned about that, about school-specific supplements to your application?
Yeah, so I think you make a couple of really important points, and these variables are sort of related to each other. So as students are started applying to more and more and more colleges, typically it's really the more highly selective colleges that have school-specific essays. If you're applying to a bunch of, maybe like top 100 colleges, like, versus, Princeton's going to throw a ton of essays at you, right? The Ivies are going to throw a ton of school-specific essays at you. They're not trying to make it easy, right? And they want to really be able to differentiate and know why you're a great fit. There's a lot more information that's required because you're competing with kids who have all these things in common. So it's like asking the additional question might be that little bit of a difference of pushing you over the edge versus another kid. So I would say that's why, going back to the school list and the school selection conversation, not putting 20 schools on your list and setting yourself up for doing 30 essays and then doing a bunch of them really poorly because you spread yourself too thin. That's a really important point that I want to emphasize that you just made. That's why it's really good to have a calibrated school list and calibrated top choices and know what are the
Right.
applications that I really need to invest a lot of time in and not spread myself too thin, because that's what happens to a lot of students. So I think that's very important. And these school-specific essays, the other reason that a lot of students do mail them in. They write the big personal essay, which is typically what's just known as the college essay, right? Or
Right.
the essay. And that's the one that goes to all of the schools, right? It's in the common application. It's the 650 word one. And so they're kind of viewing it as like, well, this essay goes to all of the schools, so I should spend a lot of time on this one. And that's true. Like, the personal essay is very significant, but the school-specific essays are very calibrated to why you want to go to that school, right? And
Right.
so an admissions officer, they don't get to see what you put in all these other school applications. They just read those school-specific essays, and often they ask questions like, why do you want to study what you want to study? Why do you want to come to our college, right? How will you uniquely benefit from the resources or the community here? And so really
Right.
that's your like ultimate calibration to showing why you're an excellent fit for that school. And this is
Yeah.
where
And the demonstrated interest.
100%, right? Demonstrated interest isn't just like demonstrated interest. People think is like, I sent an admissions officer an email saying I'm really interested in going to this school. In all honesty, if we're being, keeping things very candid, like, you can imagine how many students are sending emails to admissions officers. Like, you can tell that probably doesn't move the needle very much, right? They could,
Yeah. Well, and it's also like you're not actually putting in a ton of effort or time,
yes,
right? The real way you demonstrate interest is with your feet.
exactly. If you're applying
Yeah.
early decision, you're giving a lot of commitment to a school. You're saying, if you accept me, I'm coming, right? So the more that you have to pay, it's like the more honest of a signal it is of how much you actually really like that school. And so if you write one of these school specific essays, it needs to speak to your overall candidacy themes. What's your narrative? Is it aerospace engineering? Is it I'm the social entrepreneur? Is it I'm the cognitive science kid? Is it I'm the women's rights activist? Whatever it is, the more niche, the better, right? Because you're going to have less surface area of overlap with other students, right? If you say business, you're going to have a lot of surface area overlap with other students. A lot of students want to do business. If you say social entrepreneurship, much thinner niche inside of business, right? You're not going to overlap with as many students, right? Make it niche, make it relevant to your profile, and then show how you will instantiate that and pursue it at the school. Which professors, which classes, which research labs, which clubs. We had a student who launched one of the first high school chapters for a certain health advocacy club in New York State. It was one of the first chapters. Her college campus wasn't going to have this club yet. She put in her essays, I will help to found this club and make it the first chapter at this college that I'm going to go to. That's interesting to an admissions officer. Like, kid's going to come here and actually contribute unique, novel value that also relates to their resume. And I see this continuity of, well, they've done this in the past and they're going to keep doing it in the future. And that's the role they're going to play on my campus. And I could see it in a very tangible way. They're giving me very specific pieces of information like classes, professors, and I know how they'll be enabled by the school and how they will make the school community a better place in a very specific way that relates to their interests.
Right. Great. Well, yeah, that's very good advice. Thank you. And yeah, I think this, we're up over an hour here. I feel like we've covered a lot of really important and good advice. Do you have anything you want to close with or any kind of parting thoughts?
No, I think that's about it. I would just say, all these different things. So we've spoken about 9 different things. I would say, even if you can really capitalize on even one or two or three or improve on those, one of the biggest things that doesn't take a ton of time is to figure out an early decision school and gives you a
Hmm.
massive advantage. If you're a kid going into ninth grade, be careful about getting some of those early B's on your transcript that you might not be thinking might hurt you in 3 years. The school specific supplements don't talk about Columbia's in New York City, so that's why you want to go to Columbia. That's not good enough, right? We need to be more specific than that. So even if you just take a little bit from any one of these things, or even all of them together, they can really help to separate you as a candidate and hopefully help to improve your odds of getting into the school you want to go to.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Sam Hassell from Westchester Prep. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me and using the code podcast. You can get 10% off at checkout.